When I heard the bathroom door creak open while I was still in the shower, I didn't panic, not at first. I thought it was my husband grabbing his razor or towel like he sometimes did. But then I heard a voice. Not his. Younger. Surprised. Quiet. I froze, mid-reach for the shampoo, water still running down my back. I turned slightly, and through the foggy glass, I saw him. The nephew. Standing still. We locked eyes for a second that felt like a year. He didn't move. Neither did I. Then, just as suddenly, he backed away, muttering apologies and shutting the door. My heart was pounding, not out of fear, but out of something far more dangerous. Embarrassment? Excitement? I didn't know. I stayed under the hot water long after he left, trying to wash off the feeling that clung to my skin like steam. That moment should have been a mistake we never talked about. But it wasn't. It became a beginning. A quiet spark that I should have snuffed out. Instead, I fed it. With glances. With silence. With all the things I didn't say. That day, something shifted in me. And 3 months later, my marriage was hanging by a thread I didn't know how to mend. But let me tell you what really happened, how a single glance in the wrong place shattered everything I thought was solid. Before I reveal the truth I've buried for months, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and answer this: have you ever done something so small, so quick, so unintentional, and yet it changed everything? I never thought I would be the kind of woman who tells herself quiet lies. The kind that sits in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of tea gone cold, convincing herself that everything is fine. That love just matures into something less urgent, that comfort is the natural replacement for passion. That silence at dinner means stability, not distance. But I had been telling myself those lies for years. 7, to be exact. My husband and I had a good life. At least, that's what I told anyone who asked. We had a house we paid off early, a garden I kept alive, matching robes, a shelf of vitamins we both never forgot to take. We rarely argued. Rarely touched. Rarely looked at each other long enough to see anything unexpected. The truth is, I had been craving something I couldn't name. Not love, I had that, in a careful, efficient way. Not attention, I didn't want to be admired in passing. I wanted to be noticed. Seen. The kind of look that doesn't glance over you, but lingers, wondering. So when my husband told me his nephew was coming to stay for a few days, I didn't think twice. He just needs a quiet place while his apartment gets fumigated, he said. I nodded. Of course, I replied. No problem. I smiled, but something in me tensed. I didn't like the idea of our routines being disturbed. He arrived on a Wednesday. Polite, friendly, respectful. With a bag slung over one shoulder and a smile that was easy. He hugged my husband first, then me, quick and light. He smelled faintly of cologne and laundry detergent, and something else I couldn't place. Something like carelessness. Like youth. I showed him the guest room. I had washed the sheets, dusted the lamp. When I turned to leave, he said, "Thanks for letting me stay. This place is cozy. Feels like a real home." And I smiled, a little too long. The first few days were uneventful. He kept mostly to himself, worked on his laptop, offered to help with dinner. He complimented the food. Was attentive but never overbearing. And I found myself noticing things I hadn't paid attention to in years. The way his voice softened when he said my name. How he always made sure to ask if I needed help, even if I didn't. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I caught myself holding one of his t-shirts longer than I should have. It was soft, worn at the collar. I shook my head and laughed at myself. What was I doing? This was ridiculous. Then came the morning everything changed. My husband had left early for the office. I decided to take a long shower, something I rarely did anymore. The water was comforting, warm, loud enough to drown out my thoughts. I was humming to myself when I heard the door open. And then, that moment. That frozen moment when his eyes met mine through the glass. Afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not because of what he saw, but because of how I felt. Exposed. Alive. It wasn't right, I knew that. But it was real. The entire day, we avoided eye contact. I stayed in the kitchen longer than usual, busied myself with unnecessary tasks, reorganizing the spice rack, wiping the countertops twice. He barely came downstairs. But when he did, there was a quiet in him that hadn't been there before. Not discomfort. Awareness. That night, when my husband got home, everything felt normal on the surface. We had dinner. Watched a bit of TV. He went to bed early, tired from work. I stayed up, pretending to read a magazine I'd flipped through a dozen times already. I could feel the tension in the house like static. It wasn't dramatic, not loud or angry. Just present. A low hum underneath every movement. I told myself it would pass. That I was imagining things. That nothing happened. But something had. Something had cracked open in me, a door I had kept locked for years. And now it had been nudged open. Later that night, I found myself standing at the top of the stairs, listening. His door was closed. No light. No sound. I took one step down, then another, and then stopped. What was I doing? I turned around and went back to my room. My husband was asleep. I lay down beside him and stared at the ceiling. In the dark, I whispered to no one, it didn't mean anything. But even I didn't believe myself. The following morning began like any other, but nothing felt the same. I moved slower through the kitchen, as if the air was heavier, thick with everything unsaid. My husband had already left for work, leaving behind the scent of his aftershave and the half-empty mug he always forgot to rinse. I stood at the sink with my hands in lukewarm water, scrubbing a plate that was already clean. I tried to keep myself occupied, folded towels, made the bed, opened all the windows to let in the breeze. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the image from yesterday. Not the accidental glance, but the pause. That single suspended moment that hovered between us. He didn't come downstairs until almost noon. I was trimming the roses by the kitchen window when I heard his footsteps. There was hesitation in them, like he wasn't sure if he should make noise or disappear entirely. When he entered the room, we exchanged the briefest of greetings. I didn't trust my voice, and he seemed just as cautious. We moved around each other like strangers in a shared space, careful not to make contact. But even in that avoidance, something charged the air between us. An awareness. I noticed the way he stood a little too far when he reached for a glass, how he avoided looking directly at me. That tension, quiet, simmering, wrapped itself around every gesture. Around 3 in the afternoon, the house felt too small. I told him I was going for a walk, and he nodded silently. I didn't ask if he wanted to come. I needed space to think. To breathe. But when I returned an hour later, he was on the porch, sitting on the old swing with his headphones on. He saw me approaching, took them off, and smiled. Not a big smile, just a small, careful one. I returned it without thinking. The rest of the day passed without anything unusual, but the silence between us wasn't awkward. It was full. Full of things not said, looks not exchanged, steps taken and retracted. I kept replaying the moment in the bathroom over and over, dissecting it until I wasn't sure what was real and what I had invented. At dinner, my husband seemed tired, distracted. He asked a few questions about the garden, the groceries, work emails. I answered politely, as always. We didn't talk about his nephew. We didn't talk about anything important. Just safe things. Comfortable things. Things that didn't ask too much. After we ate, my husband went upstairs early, claiming he had a headache. I cleaned the kitchen slowly, as if stretching the task could keep the rest of the night from coming. Eventually, I turned off the lights and made my way to the living room. He was there, reading on the couch. A different book this time. I sat in the armchair across from him, pretending to check something on my phone. He didn't speak, but I could feel his gaze. It was different from before, not unsure, not embarrassed. Curious. Gentle. I looked up. And we kissed. No words. No lead up. Just a pause in time, a stillness that asked for no permission. His lips were soft, uncertain, and then gone. We both pulled away at the same time, as if touching a hot surface. I couldn't breathe. My pulse was deafening. I looked at him, his eyes wide, jaw tight, and I didn't know what to say. So I said nothing. I got up and went upstairs without looking back. I brushed my teeth with trembling hands. My reflection in the mirror looked exactly the same, but I didn't feel like myself anymore. I undressed in silence, put on my nightgown, and slid under the covers beside my sleeping husband. I lay there, eyes open, listening to the night sounds of the house, the creak of wood, the hum of the fridge, the faint shifting of wind through the trees. Somewhere downstairs, he still existed in the same space as me, still breathing, still moving. And yet we had crossed a line I couldn't pretend didn't exist. Sleep didn't come easily. I turned over again and again, searching for a position that felt natural. But nothing did. My skin still buzzed with the memory of his lips, and my mind tried to stitch reason into what I'd done. Tried to explain it as confusion. As loneliness. As temporary madness. But I knew better. That kiss, of brief, soft, unfinished, wasn't an accident. It wasn't a slip. It was a choice. One I made as easily as blinking, as breathing. And now, there was no way to go back. No way to erase the feeling that had woken something in me. Something I thought had long since gone to sleep. In the darkness, I reached for my husband's hand beneath the covers, just to remember what it felt like. His fingers didn't move. He was deep in sleep, unaware that the woman beside him was no longer entirely his. I stayed like that for hours, motionless, listening, waiting for the guilt to rise up and drown me. But it didn't. Not yet. The next morning began with the scent of coffee drifting upstairs, a familiar comfort that usually eased me into the day. But not today. I lay still in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, my body motionless while my mind moved in chaotic circles. My husband was already up, already immersed in his routine. I could hear the news murmuring from the kitchen, his spoon clinking against the mug, the rustle of the newspaper. It was a life that went on. Unaware. Untouched. I moved slowly, deliberately, choosing clothes that didn't call attention, tying my hair back like I always did, applying only the lightest makeup. I wanted to look like myself. The version of me that wasn't unraveling inside. Downstairs, everything was where it should be. He smiled at me from behind his coffee, asked about the weather like he always did. I answered with a nod, careful to keep my voice neutral. His nephew wasn't in sight. "He's still sleeping?" my husband asked casually. "Probably," I replied, keeping my gaze on the toast. We didn't speak much after that. He kissed my cheek, grabbed his briefcase, and left with a gentle "see you tonight." And then I was alone again. alone in the quiet hum of a house that felt too large and too small all at once. I started cleaning, anything to keep my hands moving. I vacuumed the living room, wiped the already clean countertops, rearranged the books on the shelf. I avoided the couch. I didn't want to sit where it happened. I didn't want to relive it. But I did. Every time I passed by, my stomach tightened. He came downstairs around noon, looking cautious. His eyes met mine briefly, but we both looked away at the same time. I offered a weak smile and returned to slicing vegetables for lunch, though I wasn't hungry. "Do you want help?" he asked from behind me. "No, thank you," I replied, not turning around. The silence between us wasn't awkward anymore. It was tense. Loaded. I could feel the weight of last night hanging in the air, unspeakable and undeniable. We moved around each other with extra space, careful, like dancers in a choreography neither of us wanted to perform. After lunch, he disappeared into the backyard. I watched from the kitchen window as he sat under the old maple tree, scrolling on his phone, occasionally glancing up at the sky. He looked so at ease, so unburdened, and I wondered if I was the only one drowning. I wanted to talk to someone, anyone. But who could I possibly tell? My closest friend would judge me. My sister would never understand. And my husband, he was the last person who could know. So I did what I always did, I kept it inside, letting it twist and coil around my thoughts. Later that day, he came in and asked if I needed anything from the store. I said no. But when he asked again, I changed my mind. Maybe getting out of the house would help. Maybe breathing different air would clear my head. We drove in silence. The car smelled like him, clean, warm, faintly peppery. I rolled down the window halfway, letting the wind hit my face. At a red light, he glanced at me. "Are you okay?" he asked, softly. I didn't answer right away. Then, with a forced smile, I said, "I'm fine." He didn't press. He nodded once and turned back to the road. At the store, we split up. I wandered through the aisles, picking up things we didn't need, just to avoid walking beside him. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for a box of tea, and I hated how transparent I felt in my own skin. Like anyone could look at me and know. Like the air around me carried the guilt I wasn't ready to name. We drove back the long way, neither of us mentioning it. When we got home, my husband's car was already in the driveway. My heart jumped a little, though there was no reason for it to. We hadn't done anything. Not really. But still, I felt exposed. Dinner was uneventful. The three of us sat at the table like any normal family. My husband talked about a client meeting, shared a minor frustration about traffic, made a joke about the neighbor's new mailbox. I laughed at the right places, nodded when needed, and avoided eye contact with the person sitting across from me. After dinner, my husband offered to do the dishes, which was rare. I agreed, grateful for the few moments of space. I walked outside and sat on the porch swing, wrapping my cardigan tighter around my shoulders. The evening air was cool, and the sky was turning the kind of soft pink that always made me feel small and contemplative. A few minutes later, I heard the door open and close behind me. I didn't turn. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. I didn't respond. "I shouldn't have," he trailed off. Still, I said nothing. I stared at the streetlight flickering at the end of the block. After a long pause, he added, "I didn't mean to make things weird." I almost laughed. As if weird was the problem. As if weird even began to describe what we had stepped into. I finally turned to him, my voice low. "It's already weird," I said. "We can't pretend it's not." He nodded, looking down at his hands. "I know." We sat in silence after that, the swing creaking softly beneath us. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't dramatic. Just two people sitting in the middle of a mistake they didn't know how to undo. Later that night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, I stared at the ceiling again. But this time, the ceiling didn't feel like a blank canvas. It felt like a mirror, reflecting everything I was trying to hide. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep. But all I saw behind my eyelids was a pair of eyes meeting mine through the steam of a shower. And a kiss that should never have happened. The days that followed unfolded with a deceptive calm, the kind that lingers before a storm, when everything feels unnaturally quiet. My routines remained the same, yet I moved through them with a strange detachment, like someone performing a role they no longer connected to. I made breakfast, folded towels, watered the plants, but none of it grounded me. My thoughts wandered constantly, slipping back to that moment, that single kiss, like a pebble in my shoe I couldn't ignore. I started avoiding places in the house that felt too small, too intimate. The living room, the hallway outside the guest room, even the porch swing, all became minefields. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something more complicated. Anticipation, maybe. Regret tangled with curiosity. The sense that something had begun and I was powerless to stop its slow, steady crawl through my life. One afternoon, my husband asked me if I could pick up a few things from the store. He had meetings all day, and I didn't argue. I welcomed the excuse to leave the house, to breathe different air. As I grabbed my bag, the nephew appeared at the top of the stairs. "I can come with you," he said, too casually. My pulse jumped. "That's not necessary." He hesitated. "I need a few things anyway." I didn't respond, just walked out to the car. He followed. The drive was quiet. The radio played softly in the background, but the silence between us was louder. I could feel him beside me, his presence humming in my awareness like background noise I couldn't shut off. We arrived at the store and wandered through the aisles separately, regrouping at the checkout with a handful of items neither of us really needed. As we walked back to the car, the clouds above shifted, and a light drizzle began to fall. "Let's wait it out," he said, pointing to a bench under a nearby awning. We sat in silence, watching the rain speckle the pavement. It wasn't cold, but I wrapped my arms around myself anyway. He sat beside me, elbows on his knees, staring ahead. "This isn't going away, is it?" he said after a long pause. I didn't answer immediately. "No," I finally whispered. He nodded slowly. "I didn't plan it. You know that, right?" I looked at him, really looked. His face was open, earnest. There was no manipulation in his expression, no agenda. Just confusion. And something that looked dangerously close to hope. "I know," I said, softer than I meant to. The rain slowed. We stood and walked back to the car without another word. On the drive home, he took a turn I didn't expect. "Shortcut," he said quickly. But instead of taking us directly back, he pulled into a small park lot by the lake, the kind of place people walk their dogs or eat lunch in their cars. He parked and looked over at me. "I just need a minute," he said. I nodded, though I wasn't sure why. We sat there for a while, not speaking. The lake shimmered in the overcast light, and the stillness of it felt like a reflection of what was between us. Calm on the surface. Turmoil underneath. "I used to come here when I was a kid," he said. "With my dad. Before things got messy." I didn't know what to say to that. I wasn't sure he needed a response. He turned to me. "You don't have to say anything. I needed to remember who I was before all this." I looked at him, at the tension in his jaw, the quiet way he was holding himself together, and felt something shift. Not attraction. Not even guilt. Something more human. Recognition, maybe. That even in this tangled, inappropriate mess, we were two people trying to find something we'd lost. We returned home without speaking. My husband wasn't back yet, and the house felt heavy with the weight of what hadn't been said. I went to the kitchen, started unpacking groceries that didn't need to be unpacked, just for the motion. He disappeared upstairs. That evening, I cooked dinner like always. My husband came home later than usual, looking exhausted. He kissed my forehead and thanked me for the meal. The three of us ate together again, and the silence that once felt warm now felt suffocating. I watched them talk, casual, polite, and wondered if he could sense the shift. If some part of him, buried deep beneath routine and trust, was aware that something had cracked. After dinner, I took a walk alone. The sky had cleared, and the air smelled of wet earth. I wandered through the neighborhood with no direction, just the sound of my footsteps and the distant hum of traffic. I passed houses with lights on inside, silhouettes moving behind curtains, lives unfolding in normalcy. I envied them. By the time I returned, the house was quiet. My husband was in his office, the nephew in the guest room. I went straight to bed, undressed in the dark, slipped under the covers, and stared at the ceiling. I didn't know how to undo what had begun. I didn't even know if I wanted to. But I knew this, the life I had been living, the woman I had been pretending to be, it was no longer sustainable. Something had shifted, and there was no going back. Only forward. Into uncertainty. Into consequence. And for the first time in years, I wasn't numb. I was terrified. The day began with a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the house itself was holding its breath. I woke earlier than usual, my body already alert before the sun had fully risen. I lay in bed for a while, listening to the familiar creaks of the walls, the birds stirring outside, the occasional sound of a car passing in the distance. My husband was still asleep beside me, his breathing slow and even, his face turned away. I watched him for a moment and wondered if he sensed anything different. If something in his subconscious noticed the weight between us, the shift that had quietly unraveled our normal. He stirred as I got out of bed, muttering something unintelligible, then rolled over and fell back into sleep. I dressed in silence, choosing a soft blue blouse and dark jeans, nothing unusual, nothing that would draw attention. I tied my hair back loosely and went downstairs. The kitchen felt colder than it should. I turned on the kettle, lined up 3 mugs like always, and tried to shake the tremor in my hands. The nephew came in moments later, his expression guarded. He nodded a silent good morning and moved to pour cereal into a bowl. I nodded back and turned to the stove, pretending to be absorbed in measuring out coffee grounds. My husband appeared last, groggy but pleasant, kissing my cheek and thanking me for the tea. We moved through the routine like a well-rehearsed script, each of us saying just enough and no more. I could feel my heart beating too fast the entire time, afraid I might say something wrong or look somewhere I shouldn't. After breakfast, my husband left for a day trip. His sister needed help moving a few things, and he'd offered to drive down. I nodded when he told me, pretending to be mildly concerned about the long hours. Inside, my stomach tightened. As soon as the front door closed, the house became too quiet. I went straight to the laundry room, loading the machine with clothes that didn't need washing, just for the sound, the motion, the distraction. I scrubbed the countertop, wiped down the handles of the fridge, rearranged the spice rack again. But it didn't help. Nothing helped. Eventually, I found myself standing in the living room, unsure what to do next. That was when he walked in. He didn't say anything, just leaned against the doorframe and watched me for a moment. "Do you want to get some air?" he asked. I hesitated, then nodded. We left without speaking, walking out the back gate and down the trail that led to the small park a few blocks away. It was quiet there, no children, no dogs, just the soft rustle of wind through the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. We walked slowly, side by side, keeping a polite distance between us. Every step felt measured, cautious. But the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy with things unspoken. At a bench near the edge of the path, we stopped. He sat first. I joined him. "I didn't mean for this to happen," I said finally, staring straight ahead. "I know," he said. "Neither did I." For a moment, we just sat there, the breeze brushing against our faces. "But it did," I added, barely above a whisper. He didn't respond, and I didn't expect him to. We stayed like that for a long time, not speaking, not moving. And then, slowly, he reached for my hand. I should have pulled away. I knew that. But I didn't. His fingers were warm and tentative, his grip light but certain. And we kissed. It was quiet. It was wrong. And it happened anyway. We pulled apart at the same time, both of us turning slightly, avoiding each other's gaze. The silence returned, but it was different now. Not filled with tension. Not heavy. Just still. When we walked back, neither of us said a word. The sky was beginning to shift toward early evening, golden light catching in the leaves, painting everything with a softness that didn't match what I felt inside. At home, I went straight to the kitchen and busied myself with dinner preparations, even though no one would eat for hours. I needed the noise, the clatter of pots, the hiss of boiling water, to fill the emptiness. He stayed upstairs. I didn't see him again until much later, just after sunset, when he came down to get a glass of water. We passed each other in the hallway, and he paused, meeting my eyes. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. I nodded. "Me too." Then he walked away. That night, I lay in bed alone. My husband wouldn't be home until the next morning, and the emptiness of the room felt louder than any sound. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts racing in circles, replaying every word, every look, every choice I had made. I kept telling myself it was just a mistake. Just one moment. Just a kiss. But I knew better. It was a line. And I had crossed it. The morning light filtered through the curtains with a gentleness that felt deceptive. I sat up slowly, still dressed from the night before, my body stiff from a restless sleep. The air in the bedroom was still, almost too still, as if the house itself had paused to wait for my next move. My husband would be home within a few hours, and I could already feel the shift beginning inside me. There was no undoing what had happened. No way to erase the memory of that second kiss, quiet and hesitant, yet deeply deliberate. We had crossed another line. And the distance from the first to the second had been dangerously short. I got up, showered, dressed in silence. I chose a long-sleeved top, something soft and unremarkable. I tied my hair up tightly, as if that would help me contain the chaos that had settled under my skin. Downstairs, the kitchen was spotless. I had cleaned it before bed, methodically, hoping that scrubbing surfaces might also scrub away guilt. It hadn't. He was already in the living room, sitting with a book he wasn't reading. When I entered, he looked up briefly, then returned his gaze to the page. We didn't speak. The air between us wasn't angry or tense, it was quiet, but dense. Like a fog neither of us knew how to walk through. I busied myself with breakfast, not because I was hungry, but because I needed something to do. I toasted bread, sliced fruit, poured 2 glasses of water. I set the plates down with more force than necessary, the small sound of ceramic against wood louder than I intended. He looked up again, and for a second, our eyes met. We sat across from each other in silence, eating slowly, mechanically. At one point, his foot shifted under the table and brushed against mine. We both froze. He pulled back. I kept eating. Eventually, he pushed his plate away and stood. "I'll be out back," he said. I nodded without looking at him. Once I heard the screen door close behind him, I exhaled. My hands trembled slightly as I cleared the dishes, rinsing them under the tap, letting the water run longer than necessary. I didn't know what I was waiting for. An answer? A plan? A sign? None came. I found myself pacing through the house, unable to settle. I checked the clock constantly. My husband was due home around noon. I glanced at the driveway every few minutes, even though I knew it was too early. I wiped down the counters again, arranged the throw pillows on the couch, then rearranged them. I looked for things to fix, anything to distract me from the storm building inside. At 11:30, I heard the sound of a car pulling in. My stomach dropped. I rushed to the window, saw his familiar silhouette stepping out, lifting a small box from the passenger seat. He looked tired but calm, the same man who had kissed me goodbye yesterday morning, unaware of the unraveling thread behind him. I opened the door before he could knock, offering a quick smile. "Welcome back." "Hey," he said. Trip took a bit longer than expected. Her place was a mess. I nodded, stepping aside so he could enter. He glanced around. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I replied, too quickly. "Fine." He set the box down by the stairs. "Where's he?" "In the backyard," I said, turning toward the kitchen. My husband followed me in, his voice casual. "Did anything come up while I was gone?" I shook my head. "No. Quiet day." He opened the fridge, took out a bottle of water, and leaned against the counter. "You look tired." I forced a laugh. "Didn't sleep well." He nodded. "Me neither." We talked briefly about his sister, the traffic, a neighbor's barking dog. The kind of conversation that once would have felt normal but now rang hollow in my ears. Every word felt like it belonged to another life. Later, I watched him walk into the backyard to greet his nephew. I stayed inside, leaning against the frame of the open window, pretending to straighten the curtains as I watched their brief exchange. My husband clapped him on the shoulder, said something that made him laugh, and I wondered if he felt even a hint of suspicion. But nothing in his posture suggested it. By afternoon, the house had settled back into its usual rhythm. My husband napped on the couch, the TV playing quietly. The nephew had gone upstairs. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at a grocery list I had started, the pen unmoving in my hand. I couldn't focus. Everything felt louder inside my head. Every glance, every word we had exchanged since he arrived, now sat in my memory like broken glass. I kept wondering when I had made the actual decision. Was it in the bathroom that first day? On the couch? In the park? Or had it been earlier, when I first felt the absence of something in my marriage and did nothing about it? That evening, my husband grilled dinner. He handed me a plate with his usual smile, the same way he had for years. The familiarity of it should have comforted me. Instead, it made the knot in my chest tighten. I realized then that the worst part wasn't what had happened, it was how normal everything still looked on the outside. After dinner, we sat on the porch, the three of us. The conversation was easy, the kind you could overhear and never suspect a thing. They joked about childhood stories, about old family vacations, about food and movies. I laughed when I was supposed to, nodded at the right times, but I felt like a ghost sitting in my own body. When the night cooled and everyone retreated inside, I lingered. The stars were beginning to pierce the darkening sky, and the breeze whispered through the trees like it carried secrets. I stared into the distance, my hands folded in my lap, trying to steady the racing in my chest. I had never wanted to hurt anyone. I hadn't planned any of this. But I had chosen every step that led here, even the ones I told myself were innocent. When I finally went inside, I paused outside the guest room. The door was closed. I stood there for a long moment, listening. There was no sound. Just the quiet of a house on the edge of something inevitable. I turned away and walked to my bedroom, where my husband was already asleep, one arm draped across the pillow where I should have been. I lay down beside him, inch by inch, careful not to wake him. And as I stared at the ceiling once again, I realized something with frightening clarity. We were already living in the aftermath. Only no one had said it out loud yet. The morning passed in fragments. I went through the motions of daily life like a shadow, pouring coffee, folding laundry, watering the plants that lined the windowsill. Everything felt distant, like I was observing someone else live my life. My husband had left early for work, and the nephew remained upstairs, his presence like a pulse just behind the walls. I hadn't spoken to him since the day before, but silence no longer served as safety. It was a place where everything dangerous could grow. By late afternoon, I stood by the back door, holding a pair of gardening gloves, though I had no intention of using them. I stared out at the yard, unsure if I was waiting for a thought to form or simply stalling the inevitable. The sun was low, the air warm but beginning to shift with the edge of evening. I didn't hear him come downstairs. "I think something's wrong with the old storage unit," he said quietly from behind me. I turned, startled not by his voice but by the fact that I hadn't heard his footsteps at all. "The one in the guest house?" I asked. He nodded. "Yeah. The wood frame's warped, and there's some damp boxes that probably need tossing." I hesitated. "All right. I'll help." We walked across the backyard in silence, the soft crunch of gravel beneath our shoes the only sound. The small guest house, which had once belonged to my husband's father, stood detached from the main house, mostly unused these days. It had always carried a stillness, a kind of quiet memory that never really left the wood and stone of its frame. He pushed open the door and held it for me. Inside, it smelled faintly of dust and something older, cardboard, maybe. Paper. Forgotten time. The light was dim, filtered through old curtains, but there was enough to see by. Boxes were stacked along one side, and a few pieces of mismatched furniture were covered in sheets. I bent down to check a box, pulling the top open gently. Books. Damp at the corners. The smell of mildew rose softly. "I'll grab a trash bag," he said, disappearing toward the small attached storage closet. I stayed crouched by the box, my fingers brushing the spines of novels I hadn't read in years. Some were my husband's from college, others mine from before we were married. Before everything had settled into predictability. Before routine had become a quiet form of isolation. He returned with a roll of bags and a small flashlight. We worked for a while without speaking, sorting books and papers, deciding what could be saved and what needed to be thrown out. There was something comforting about the simplicity of it, decisions that had clear answers. Keep. Toss. Save. Gone. I wished everything could be that easy. At one point, I stood too quickly, and the world tilted slightly. I reached out instinctively and felt his hands on my arms, steadying me. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, but didn't move away. Neither did he. We stood there, still and too close, surrounded by boxes and the faint sound of wind outside. And then, without a word, he leaned forward. We spent the night together. The moment came and went like the passing of a season, slow at first, then all at once. There was no declaration, no drama. Just the quiet collapse of boundaries that had been fraying for weeks. It wasn't passionate or wild. It was quiet. Intentional. A decision made in silence. After, we sat on the edge of the old couch, both fully clothed again, the air between us different in a way that was hard to name. I didn't feel the relief I thought I might. I didn't feel victorious or free. I felt hollow. Like something had broken, not loud, but permanently. "I should go," he said, standing. I nodded. He walked out without looking back. I stayed for a long time, staring at the floor, the ceiling, the space between the two. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just sat. When I finally walked back into the main house, the lights were dimmed, the windows closed. The clock in the hallway ticked steadily, indifferent to everything that had happened. I showered. Not because I felt dirty, but because I didn't know what else to do. The water ran too hot, then too cold, and I didn't adjust it. I stood there until my fingers wrinkled and my thoughts blurred. I crawled into bed next to my husband long after midnight. He was asleep, his breathing slow and deep. I watched him for a long time in the dark, counting the spaces between each inhale, each exhale. I didn't sleep. My eyes stayed open until the light began to return to the sky, soft and indifferent. I wondered if he could sense it, that something irreversible had shifted, and that everything we had built now stood on cracked ground. And yet, I knew that in the morning, we'd go on as if nothing had changed. But I had. And I couldn't go back. The morning after didn't feel any different at first. The sun rose, the light came in, the birds made their usual noise near the window. But I didn't move. I lay still in bed, my back to my husband, listening to his soft breathing and the occasional rustle of the sheets as he shifted in his sleep. My body felt heavy, not with exhaustion, but with weight, the kind that settles in your bones when something irreversible has taken root. When I finally got up, my feet touched the cold floor with more hesitation than usual. I made my way to the bathroom without turning on the light. I didn't want to see myself. I didn't want to look into the mirror and search for what might be different, what might have changed now that a line had been crossed so far behind me, it was no longer visible. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of coffee. He had already made a pot, as he often did on weekends. It was one of his small, habitual kindnesses. I poured a cup and held it in both hands, not drinking, just waiting for the heat to wake me from whatever fog I was living in. He appeared behind me with his usual Saturday smile, kissed my cheek, and asked how I slept. I lied. Better. The truth sat on my tongue like glass, sharp and silent. The day unfolded like so many others before it. We went through our chores, cleaning out the garage, sorting through old clothes, walking through the garden and noting which plants had begun to wilt in the heat. The nephew stayed mostly in his room, only coming out briefly to grab a drink or say something polite and short. I didn't look at him, and he didn't look at me. But his presence, like always, filled the air. By late afternoon, the tension began to fray my nerves. I offered to go to the store for dinner ingredients, even though we had more than enough food. I needed to move, to breathe, to put distance between me and the walls of the house. My husband handed me his wallet and asked for something minor, lemons or milk, I don't remember now. I nodded and left, the door closing behind me with a quietness that somehow felt too final. Driving gave me a strange sense of relief. The hum of the tires, the rhythm of the traffic lights, the anonymity of passing strangers, it all felt safe, removed. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't get away from the image that had rooted itself deep in my mind, the small guest house, the old couch, the silence afterward. When I returned, the driveway was empty. Inside, the house was quiet. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe they had gone for a walk. Maybe they were in the backyard. But something didn't feel right. The energy had shifted. There was a stillness that wasn't peaceful, it was too sharp around the edges. I set the bags on the counter and went upstairs to check the guest room. The door was open. The bed unmade. His backpack gone. I froze. Then I moved quickly down the hall to our bedroom. Nothing missing. No sign of anything unusual. I turned back to the stairs and stopped when I saw the phone on the entry table. Mine. My hands went cold. I picked it up, opened the lock, and instantly saw the thread, the one I had forgotten, the one I had never deleted. Messages. A few. Not many. But enough. One of them had a timestamp from that afternoon. A reply. From him. My stomach dropped. I scrolled up and found the last message I had sent. It wasn't explicit. Nothing that couldn't be explained away, maybe. But it was there. A digital trace of something that wasn't supposed to exist. I looked at the notification bar. Missed call. From my husband. An hour ago. I didn't remember the phone ringing. A second missed call. Then a third. The front door opened downstairs. I turned to stone. His footsteps were deliberate. Slow. I heard the sound of keys hitting the table, then the creak of the floorboard near the coat rack. I stayed on the stairs. When he looked up at me, his expression was unreadable. He held my phone in his hand. My phone. The same one I had just picked up moments ago from where I had left it that morning. Only I hadn't. He had. The one in my hand was his. Somehow, sometime earlier that day, we had switched phones. I didn't move. I didn't speak. He lifted the device in his hand, turned the screen toward me, and asked a single question. What is this? I couldn't speak. My mouth opened, but no sound came. My heart was pounding so hard it made my ears ring. I tried to think, to form a sentence, to find something that could make this less terrible than it was. But there was nothing. No excuse. No justification. Only the truth, hanging in the space between us like a thick, choking fog. He stepped up one stair. Then another. I want you to tell me exactly what this is, he said again, quieter now, but not softer. Still, I said nothing. Because I couldn't lie anymore. And the truth would destroy everything. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice or slam anything. He just looked at me, his face a mixture of pain and something else, something I couldn't fully name. Disbelief? Disappointment? Maybe both. He turned away and walked back down the stairs. I stood frozen until I heard the front door open again. Then close. Only this time, it didn't feel like he'd be coming back. After the door closed, the silence that filled the house was different than any I had known before. It wasn't just quiet. It was absence. A hollow space that swallowed sound. I stood on the stairs for a long time, unable to move, unable to breathe in a way that felt normal. My legs were trembling, and my chest ached with something beyond panic. It was the sick recognition that the truth had landed exactly where I had been afraid it would. I walked slowly back down the stairs, one hand dragging along the wall for balance, and found myself standing in the middle of the living room. My phone, no, his phone, was still clutched in my hand. I stared at the screen, then placed it on the table like it was something foreign, no longer mine. I sat down on the couch, back straight, hands folded tightly together in my lap. The room still smelled faintly of him. The pillow where he often rested his head still held the smallest indentation. I stared at it as though that small dent in the fabric might offer answers, or forgiveness, or at least some kind of direction. He hadn't taken his bag. His jacket still hung by the door. Maybe he just needed air. Maybe he was driving in circles, trying to think. Maybe. The word repeated in my head until it was meaningless. I stood again, unable to sit still, and wandered through the house like a stranger. I touched the framed photographs on the wall. Our wedding. A vacation in the mountains. A photo from his mother's birthday. All of them smiling versions of us, suspended in time, blissfully unaware of what the future would bring. I touched my face in one of them, the corner of a print behind glass. I looked so sure. So present. Now, I felt like a blurred outline of that woman. Upstairs, I went into the guest room. It was empty. The bed still unmade, the closet door slightly ajar. A half-full water bottle on the nightstand, a book spine down on the chair by the window. The blinds were tilted, letting in slats of golden afternoon light that cut across the floor like bars. He had left too. He must have. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. Time passed, but I didn't feel it. The light shifted. The shadows moved. But inside me, everything stayed in that one frozen moment, his voice, the weight of the question, the silence that followed. I wanted to cry, but nothing came. Eventually, the doorbell rang. I didn't move right away. I wasn't expecting anyone. I didn't want to answer. But something in me said I had to. At the door stood my husband's sister. She looked concerned, holding a small bag in one hand. "He left this in the car," she said. My mouth was dry. "He's not here." She looked past me into the house. "Did something happen?" I shook my head before realizing I couldn't lie anymore. "Yes." She waited, expecting more, but I couldn't give it. She nodded slowly, handed me the bag, and said, "Tell him to call me, okay?" I nodded again. And she left. Inside the bag were a few personal things, a change of clothes, his shaving kit, a folder from work. Things he'd need if he weren't planning to come back tonight. Or maybe not at all. I sat with the bag for a while, unable to carry it upstairs, unable to place it anywhere that made sense. That night, I didn't turn on any lights. I sat in the living room in the dark, the windows open, the curtains unmoving in the still air. I didn't eat. I didn't speak. The clock ticked louder than usual. I don't know how long I stayed there. At some point, my eyes closed, but I didn't sleep. I just rested in the stillness, waiting for something, anything, to break the quiet. Around midnight, I got up and walked barefoot to the backyard. The grass was cool beneath my feet, and the sky was clear enough to see a few stars. I tilted my head back and stared at them. I tried to remember when I'd last looked up at the sky without feeling like I had to explain myself to it. I stood there for a long time, until the air grew cold and I finally felt the tears come. They were silent. Slow. They didn't bring relief. Just proof that I could still feel something. When I went back inside, the guest room was exactly as I had left it. I sat down again on the edge of the bed, picked up the book he had left behind, and stared at the page he had marked. The line that caught my eye was simple. Everything changes slowly, and then all at once. I closed the book. And for the first time, I admitted it. I had ruined everything. Not just the marriage. Not just the trust. I had ruined the quiet, the safe, the familiar. I had opened a door that could never be shut again. And now I had to live in the aftermath. The following days passed in a haze I can barely account for. Time became a blur of repeated gestures and empty hours. I moved through the house like a ghost, completing tasks without thought, eating without tasting, sleeping without rest. Every corner of the space reminded me of what had happened, not just recently, but slowly, over time. What began as tiny moments of distance, small acts of neglect or silence, had eventually hollowed out a life that, on the surface, had once looked so whole. I didn't hear from him. Not from either of them. My husband's car never returned to the driveway. His phone remained silent. The nephew's room stayed untouched, his things gone except for the book I'd left on the nightstand. A few days ago, I had opened it again, hoping the words might distract me. But they didn't. They felt flat, like I was reading in a language I no longer understood. On the fourth morning, a letter arrived. Not an email. Not a message. A letter. In his handwriting. I knew it before I opened it. The way my name was written. The deliberate curve of each letter. It wasn't long. He wrote that he had loved me deeply, even in the silence. That he had known something was wrong but never imagined this. That the betrayal wasn't just the kiss, or the moment, or even what happened that night, but that I never told him. That I let him walk blind into a home where the foundation was already crumbling. He said he didn't hate me. But he couldn't stay. Not now. Not like this. I read the letter twice. Then again. Each time the same lines felt heavier, more final. My hands trembled by the third reading, and still, I didn't cry. I just folded it, placed it back in the envelope, and set it on the kitchen table. He hadn't used the word divorce. But he hadn't needed to. I stared at the ceiling that night for what felt like hours, replaying every moment where I might have said something different, done something different. Where I might have chosen truth sooner. Where I might have said no when it mattered. But regret doesn't rewrite endings. It only makes you feel them longer. The next morning, I packed a small bag. Not to leave permanently. I didn't know where I'd even go. I just needed to not be in that house. Not for a while. The walls were too loud. The shadows too familiar. I left the bag by the front door and sat at the edge of the couch, drinking cold coffee and staring out the window. The sky was soft and gray, clouds like ash drifting lazily. It should have been beautiful, but I couldn't feel it. I heard a car approach. The sound of tires on gravel. I stood slowly, heart pounding before I even reached the door. But it wasn't him. It was a courier. A second envelope. This time from the nephew. I took it inside and opened it carefully, afraid of what I might find. He wrote less. He said he didn't plan any of it. That he never wanted to be the cause of destruction. That it started as confusion, but quickly became something else. Something he couldn't explain. He didn't ask for forgiveness, and he didn't offer excuses. Only that he felt something real, even if it was brief, and even if it came at the cost of something much bigger. He ended with, "I'm sorry. For all of it. But especially for not leaving sooner." And that was it. I sat back down with both letters on the table in front of me. Two men who had entered my life in different ways. Two men who were now gone. I didn't know who I was anymore without them. Not just because of what happened, but because everything I thought I knew about myself, about loyalty, about boundaries, about love, had been tested and broken. I spent the rest of the day in the garden. I pulled weeds with bare hands, ignoring the dirt under my nails. I pruned branches too aggressively. I repotted plants that didn't need moving. I needed to feel useful. I needed something I could fix. But nothing was fixed. When the sun began to set, I sat in the grass, my legs folded beneath me, hands raw and streaked with soil. I looked at the house from the outside, the way strangers might see it. Quiet. Tidy. A place where nothing looked wrong. But inside, everything was different. I stood and went back in. Showered. Changed into fresh clothes. I sat at the kitchen table one last time and looked around at what remained. The photo frames still hung. The bed upstairs was still made. The dishes still sat in the rack to dry. Life had not exploded. It had not burned. It had simply shifted. Quietly. Without ceremony. And yet, I was no longer the woman who once lived in this house. I had become someone else. Someone I didn't yet fully understand. I took both letters and placed them in the top drawer of the desk in the hallway. Not to forget. But to remember. And then I opened the front door, stepped out barefoot onto the lawn, and let the cool blades of grass remind me that even after everything, I was still here.